Hi, this is Amanda Thode from AdvancedNet. I just want to make sure that you were all set for your session.
Hello, how are you? This is Billy Benson, and I am one of the tech moderators for this session.
Great. All right. I'm going to make you host. I came into the room first, and so I was host, but I will make you host, and then you should be good to go.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Travis, are you there?
Oh, yeah, good morning. This is Travis. I'm here.
Hey, good morning. So I'm the discussant. I think I'm doing double duty as chair as well. Have they talked to you about length of presentation?
I don't. I mean, I've seen some other presentations. I know, like, I think they're doing generally 15 minutes or something like that.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Okay, just wanted to double check with you.
Great.
Yeah. So waiting for Kennedy and Lester.
Hi, everyone. How is everyone enjoying the conference?
Yeah, this is Travis. I've been enjoying it. I mean, this is my first time at this conference, so it's been, really, really neat experience. So.
And Travis, just so I get it right, how do you pronounce your last name?
Reginald.
All right, thanks. So we're still waiting on Kennedy Hill and Lester Spence, and so I'll give a few more minutes and. So I'm gonna give it maybe 2 more minutes, and if nobody else comes, we'll just go ahead and have Travis do his presentation, and then we can have a discussion. Spend a lot of time with Travis.
Yeah, and honestly, I mean, if I do end up being the sole presenter, I can imagine this turning into more of, I don't know, like a round table or something. Because I imagine the other presenters would have been maybe more empirical papers or something like that. Like mine is kind of like on more like the theory side, or like kind of contemplations for like the work we're doing. So.
I think theoretical as well.
Sorry, you were breaking up a bit. What was that?
I said I imagine that Lance would have been more empirical as well.
All right, so maybe we go ahead and get started, and we'll see if anybody else joins us. So, welcome everyone. My name is Justin Rose. I'm a dean for faculty recruitment. Oh, Lester's joining soon. Okay, great. Maybe we'll wait a second then. Welcome. All right, so maybe we'll try this again. So welcome everyone. My name is Justin Rose. I'm an associate professor of political science at Rhodes College, and I'm going to be both the discussant and chair of this panel today. So this is Progress, Affect, and Political Choice, part of the political thought and political philosophy subfield, which I'm co-chairing along with Sharice Burton-Staley. And so we're excited about the panels that we were able to put together, and excited about this one. So as of now, we have with us Travis Reginald, who's going to be presenting on making progress while maintaining Black joy and mental health, an exploration of the wariness of being a conscience for a nation. And then we also have Lester Spence, Dr. Lester Spence, who's going to be presenting on the affective turn in Black political attitudes, or fuck hope. So two exciting papers. And so I think we'll go ahead and present in the order that they appear in the program, which means we'll start off with Travis Reginald.
All right, let me just get set up here. Let's see which. Okay. Great. But yeah, thanks everyone for joining. And like I said, I mean, this has been a great conference. Mentioned before, this is my first time in this space, and the kind of conference theme it was really intriguing when I came across it, and I think where ultimately landed with this presentation is kind of different than maybe I was thinking about it initially, but I feel like one of those people who are just like, I had a message, but then I'm like, change, then I need to change at the last minute. But essentially, overall, like where I'm at and thinking about this topic with Black joy and social science research, and also a topic that Justin shared. For this paper is kind of coming out of the the events over the past year, a number of really stimulating conversations that I'm sure many of us took part in or viewed around topics of racial justice, equity, what different institutions can do, what institutions can do better to promote diversity, equity, inclusion, and I like there was a ton of these different events over the past year, and there were some recurring, I guess, things that I was hearing in these conversations, or around how people felt. One of these events, for example, was like this conversation on racial trauma and mental health, and in all these different spaces, people mentioned things like how they felt like they didn't matter, like they felt powerless, with their opinions and thoughts weren't valued, that they weren't welcome in certain spaces. And I don't know, I just maybe pause and think about, does there have to be the status quo? Like what can be done to kind of change that? And just maybe think about the state of social science research in general, and things beyond research too, but also just the role of narratives and what's included or not included in the conversation. And one of the things that stood out to me was this ideal of joy. Because throughout history, there's a number of things that threaten to steal joy or have caused despair. And I'm realizing that it can be easy to get into the habit of, I think I have it on maybe a later slide, but there's this kind of like wash, rinse, and repeat cycle that folks can go through when doing research or doing grant proposals. Like you'll talk about a topic like I don't know, like educational outcomes and for Black and brown youth or something like that, and it can be easy in a lot of different topics. So when you focus on deficits or really, I don't say play up, but like really emphasize gaps or issues, because things tend to be compelling, and so there's maybe think about like what work. Just like the lack of conversations or mention in a lot of topics that talk about race around things like joy or even just positive narratives. And so that's kind of like where it's kind of work that I'm been going through kind of comes from. And I guess when thinking about Black joy, it can be kind of, I guess counterintuitive in some way, because like there's, so much going on, but also recognize that it's not separate from, like as I hear from, it's not the absence of grief. Like, some people see joy as resistance. And then I have this quote here from Modular that you all can see, in the forms of, recognizing, how we feel and how joy plays into that. And I think that just can be really important. And and joy, people define it differently. But essentially, what I'm trying to get through in this presentation, but also in the work I'm trying to develop, is just thinking about the different ways we can embed aspects of Black joy or reasons for celebration, or positive things in our work. And there's a slide later on about questions to consider, but even for the person, like when was the last time I wrote something positive? Just almost like purely positive about Black people, or any of the work that folks are doing. Because just I don't know, the cycle that people ran like in classes or whatever. Like, there's just so much focus on like I said, like this deficit kind of approach that can creep into our research, our teaching, and kind of just taking time to reevaluate. Because even like originally thinking about this paper, I feel like it's just like unbalanced and just the amount of focus on like despair and so forth. But thinking about where joy and hopes comes into this work, and so like I said, like people think of Black joy, different things come to mind. Like you have what I have on this slide, different TV shows. At the bottom, I have pictures of Janice Burgess, who's the creator of The Backyardigans, which is a hit children's TV show, which I thought was really inspiring because like it can be really tempting to like lose our imagination or creativity for a number of reasons, and so like I think when we think about Black joy, it kind of creates more space to like not to remember, like, of course, why we're doing the work we're doing, but also realize we're maybe limiting ourselves, either consciously or unconsciously. But also just a reminder of like the numerous things call for celebration. But because the bottom picture at the bottom right is like I think people dancing from a Black Joy parade in Oakland, California. And that's why it just kind of goes for what I was saying before, like, kind of question like, where are we limiting ourselves? Where are we limiting ourselves from doing in our work? And I guess this point kind of comes around because, over the past year, as conversations around race increased, people make their statements or commitments, there's been this kind of renewed sense of possibilities, whether it's on the political front, policy, administration, all the things that people thought weren't feasible before, like, people see this kind of policy window available. Like, it's definitely great that happened, but it just reminded me of like how even myself was just limiting what I thought was possible prior to this past year. And so I think also just think about like, the points of thinking of joy, and because I think that's connected to creativity and all the things that will kind of force us out of these roles to kind of take on as, students or professors or academics or practitioners. That's why it just kind of goes on. I was saying earlier about this watch and repeat cycles, grant proposal writing, that can just keep playing into myths or perpetuate racism in research, and just think about like just things that we are overlooking and in the role of like people's well-being in the work. So, which is the last one around like a lot of people suffering in silence, and so and thinking about I guess what is one of the things that's necessary in this kind of like narrative change approach, and like I have here, I just like kind of just like the framework that the Kellogg Foundation has, which focuses a lot on racial equity, and they have this framework around truth for racial healing and transformation. And I guess one thing I'm trying to articulate is the role of narrative change and thinking about where Black joy can be embedded, within our work. And like, because you may look at this slide and be like, I've seen to do work on around mass incarceration or employment, and you have like this broad thing around narrative change across different industries and different spaces. And because we all know, like, there's a lot of stories that are untold. And a lot of things to kind of reconsider. All right, let's see. Okay, thanks. Yeah. But yeah, like, and I guess I always want to get across is in this kind of process I'm going, kind of like stepping back and kind of asking other people to step back is, because like there's things around, like I said, joy, this kind of notion of like healing, that also kind of came up in conversations over the past year of just thinking about the trauma that people have experienced, and kind of, practices that can, or ways to highlight that in our work of things that lead to healing or things that promote joy and well-being. But even on the slide, there's a lot of heavy things that you can cover, but just, but yeah. And what I have here is a picture of my hometown, Jackson, Mississippi. And this is supposed to be like, I kind of think about like a brief example of like how we think about how we go about our work. Like, I'm trying to do work around Mississippi, and like I'm sure people have heard about what's been going on in either Mississippi or in Texas around like the water issue, and people's different takes around the role of racism and so forth, and it led to like poor investment in these cities and so forth. And the more I get into research, it can be easy to kind of just focus on like these negatives or disparities or gaps, or but also realizing like a lot of my upbringing wasn't necessarily focused on it. Like there's a lot of reasons to celebrate, all the reasons, a lot of positive things, and became that happen in the city that can often be overlooked. Because I think because people don't focus on it much, or people might find it compelling. Like I said before, you're writing these proposals of lifting up work from kind of places people wouldn't expect. But and yeah, so I just have here like different questions to consider. I mean, like these some own personal reflection, but also for the audience, and whatever topic you're working on, like where's the space to how can you create room for Black joy in your work, professional and personal, as well as like kind of how the topics we work on are kind of intersecting with mental health and well-being. Because I'm just mindful of just all of the kind of just how much we're missing when we're not considering these kind of perspectives. Okay. And and then it kind of, part of it, what I've been kind of going through is just like, has been a synthesis of a lot of different things, and kind of, and what there's ideally lead to is kind of more on a theorizing front of like, once we consider how Black joy fits in our work and how well-being kind of fits within that space of being able to apply that to government, for example, actions around promoting racial equity. You probably haven't heard, any of these things have been going on around, things that, we focus on joy or even like addressing trauma or addressing healing. As great as the work that many places are doing, I think there's definitely this big aspect that are left out. And so, so those will just have some things I found from just like either from like psychology or psychiatry, a lot of different fields, and people kind of highlighting and promoting joy or happiness. And for me, I know one thing that's really important is like processing things in community. I think it can be very easy to kind of be in these silos, and also just to be forgiving of ourselves and not to be so hard on ourselves. But So in that sense, like I said before, like when I'm trying to go with this is, one is to think about the balance of how we weigh positive and negative things in our work, not getting caught up in, just being mindful of all the great things that have happened. It's not to say there isn't reason for grief or despair, but like also reasons for hope, and kind of holding those things in tension, and also bring it up in whatever kind of domains that we're in the research, and all that. And I think there's a lot of implications for teaching as well. So just kind of, just wanted to chat, and also just wanted to have a space so I can step back from like doing the work I've done a lot, because what I didn't mention in my introduction is that like I'm a grad student, of course, at Struckenberg School, but I've worked at the Urban Institute for several years in criminal justice policy, research, and just there are many things that come up, and like as you can imagine, mass incarceration and an unfair system, but also thinking about what's missing when we don't consider like well-being and joy in the work. So, but yeah, stop there. But yeah.
All right, thank you so very much. So next we have Dr. Lester Spence, who's going to talk to us again about the affective turn in Black political attitudes.
So first of all, it's great to see folk. Hold up! Oh my God, I love seeing you every time. I love seeing you. I want to apologize because I wished I did not give Justin and the members of the panel a copy of the paper in advance. I have something up. So what I'm going to do is I'm really going to, and the paper I end up writing is a bit different. So what I'm going to do is basically kind of talk through the paper. So if you think about the behavioral turn in political science more broadly, that's basically the result of a combination of a shift and a kind of a technological shift in the ability to study attitudes writ large, and then a shift in our ability to statistically determine relationships between those attitudes as represented by surveys. And then the behavior, if you think about the behavioral turn as it's reflected in Black politics, what we see is, it's interesting because what we see basically is as Michigan becomes associated with the behavioral turn of political science, the Michigan Department of Political Science ends up being one of the most important disciplines, important departments in kind of articulating that. And then they alongside the Institute for Social Research, which is also on University of Michigan's campus, as a result of 3 different waves of Black student activism in 1969 and 1977 or so, in 1986. What you see is Michigan spent a lot of resources attracting Black and students of color, Black students and students of color more broadly into political science and other disciplines. Because those Black students end up going to Michigan, they end up becoming behavioralists themselves, or we end up, I'm a Michigan guy, we end up becoming behavioralists ourselves. So one way to think about the behavioralist turn in political science more broadly is to think about it through the lens of that specific move, right? So we see people like Michael Dawson, when Michael Dawson was at Michigan, a number of Michael Dawson's graduate students will go on to do behavioralist or oriented work. Now that work is primarily concerned with quote unquote reason, right? That is, how do people think about answers to questions, and then looking at the relationship between those questions. But what happens is there's another technological shift, which makes it possible not just to assess survey attitudes, but to do 2 other things. One is to assess implicit attitudes, that is the attitudes that aren't at the forefront of our head. But then increasingly, we're able to study affect, and we study affect either through asking a set of questions, trying to get at emotional dynamics, and then connecting those to politics. Or increasingly, though we don't see this as much yet, it's also possible to use biometric measures, right? So different types of affect has different types of physiological responses in the body. Those responses can then be tested and then connected to a wide array of political phenomena. Now, what the hell does this have to do with hope? What we also see simultaneously with the technological shift is this political turn, best but not solely reflected in the election of Barack Obama. Now, Barack Obama runs on a campaign of hope. He actually writes a book called The Audacity of Hope, and he consistently uses this narrative in order to mobilize Black politics and to mobilize Black populations in certain ways. And then as a result of Obama's election, I would argue, we actually, alongside Obama's election, we actually have this turn in Black politics towards affect that focuses similarly on hope. So Diamond Phoenix's work is the most important, but there are a number of other folk either attached to Michigan or its kind of offshoots that are interested in the role of affect. And what became clear to me, was that the political valence that folk attached to hope actually reproduced a certain type of, for the lack of a better word, had a certain type of empirical challenge and then a certain type of political challenge. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a little bit of what I wrote to make a little bit more sense of this, right? A little less than 2 years ago, Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote Between the World and Me, actually more than 2 years ago. Using the structure of a letter to his son, Coates uses the tragic murder of a college classmate to ruminate on the contemporary condition, a moment where it's simultaneously possible for a self-identified Black man to be president and for police to get away with murder when the victims look like that president. Coates' work went on to great acclaim, becoming one of the most read books of the year and almost single-handedly catapulting Coates to the top of the Black chart, so to speak, but not without criticism. What we see with that work is a very specific criticism that comes out of Black folk that I would suggest kind of fits within that Obama hope dynamic. The very particular criticism that Coates' work received from Black folk was that the work lacked hope. While the work is not without flaw, Coates' understanding of politics, particularly the politics within Black communities, is decidedly narrow. There's one particular challenge folks raise of the work that I would like to interrogate, that the work isn't hopeful enough. In fact, if we can think of this brief, supposedly post-racial moment as bookended by Barack Obama's Audacity of Hope and by Coates' Between the World and Me, we can actually think about that hope turn on the one hand, and then that more realist turn on the other, right? Although those critiquing Coates for this flaw didn't cite Obama directly, one can see a hint of the position Obama took, not only in his work, but throughout his administration. A position that consistently argued that the American work in progress would inevitably generate progressive politics and victories. These victories would come at a price and would at times appear to be repealed, but they would inevitably come. I have no such belief. While hope has certain political functions, we would do well both in general and particularly in moments such as these to eschew hope. Bonnie Honeck's written powerfully about the displacement of politics. For Honeck, a number of theorists place a great deal of weight on virtue, an idea that tends to gloss over differences in favor of an ideal consensus that would have the effect of generating utopic outcomes. On the other hand, however, other theorists place weight instead on virtue, spelled a different way, an idea that recognizes the permanent existence of a remainder that cannot be reconciled, a remainder that the very attempt to reconcile generates progress even as it generates other remainders. Although Honeck doesn't expressly deal with hope in her work, nor she deal with Black politics per se, I believe that hope effectively serves the purpose of displacing politics and ends up abdicating a certain type of responsibility and perspective that we need if we are to contest what appears to be happening, not just within the United States, but throughout the world. First, the case for hope. I suggest that there are at least two different ways hope works in general, both in general and politically speaking. It works to generate and sustain an individual or group's capacity for action. And while the type of action might not necessarily matter, I suggest that it serves this function particularly in instances of high risk, long odds, and significant duress. People engage in risky activity often believing in at least a possibility of success. Similarly, people keep engaging in activity or at worst refrain in engaging in problematic activity, in part thinking about the possibility of better times. Another aspect of this context matters as well. Coates isn't just not hopeful, he doesn't exhibit hope to his son, perhaps the one person on the planet. Let me say that again. Coates isn't just not hopeful. He doesn't exhibit hope to his son, perhaps the one person on the planet who is most in need of hope for him. And that's the problem, right? If you're gonna exhibit hope to anybody, you should actually exhibit it to your kid because the kid is the person who most needs it. So it isn't just about the type of action, it's also about the person conveying hope. Parents, leaders, friends often use hope again, to help generate sustained action. While I'm loath to use anything that even comes close to sounding like a cost-benefit analysis, I do think that human action is purposeful and possesses at least something like a calculative element. And if we're given a condition in which people are either thinking about or are currently engaged in a risky activity with long odds, that condition would seem to require something that can overcome the cost, which may be daunting. Secondly, I argue that in this context, hope is not just the sentiment that enables actions or perhaps sustains actions, it's the sentiment that enables and sustains a particular type of action. I'd argue that in his works both before and during his administration, Obama evinces a kind of neoliberal egalitarianism. He believes in a national and international order governed by market dictates, and he believed that this market works best when individuals and institutions within it have relatively equitable access to the resources required to develop the human capital they need to participate in the market fully. He's no Martin Luther King Jr. By the end of Martin Luther King Jr.'s life, he'd recognized the significant problems capitalism posed for human development. However, like King, Obama does believe that equality should be embedded as much as possible in market relations. The role hope performs for Obama, and arguably for others as well, is to promote a vision of positive change for the United States. Hope in this case not only latches onto action, not only provides the possibility for action, but in effect shapes the type of action. Enabling action isn't enough because it's possible that action enabled or sustained is not the action required to generate a positive result, but can instead be the type of action that reduces rather than increases the possibility of democratic potential. Hope works then to enable and sustain action, and then to enable and sustain a certain type of action, one that builds rather than tears down human possibility. In order to carry the weight hope does, though, it's not enough to argue that hope fulfills these two goals. Those in favor of hope have to make and support two different claims. First, they have to make and support the claim that hope is the primary moving force and that is not simply helpful. That's to say it doesn't just aid the process in some way, but that is actually necessary. That without hope, such activity is impossible. A weaker version of this would suggest that it may be possible in general for activity to occur without hope, but for some populations, say children like Coach's son, for example, some populations might need it more than others. Secondarily, they have to make the claim that the work hope performs, even if it's not required, outstrips any potential negative value that hope has. I think both claims fail. The historical record is replete with instances of individuals implicitly and explicitly acting based on hope. Martin Luther King Jr. and James Baldwin are but two of the activists who relied upon hope for their activity. In King's case, much of his action appears to be shaped by the idea that the universe was a moral one and that its arc bended towards justice. This is, in effect, a hope that the fundamental nature of the universe was just, a hope driven to a significant extent by his Christian faith. In Baldwin's case, much of his action appears to be shaped not so much in an explicit religious faith, but in a faith in human nature in general. And while I do believe there's a danger in relying heavily on the civil rights movement, I do think that it works as the perfect vehicle with which to promote the idea that hope matters. How else could we imagine instance after instance after instance of Black men and women striking back against Jim Crow against incredible odds? However, even as these individuals themselves argue that hope was a guiding force that drove them to engage in the work they performed, it's not clear that hope was actually required. For as many people as can articulate their reasons for engaging in a specific act, for as many people who push hope more specifically, there are individuals who don't speak or write of hope at all. We know, for instance, that the story Rosa Parks tells us at the beginning about the beginnings of the Montgomery bus boycott aren't necessarily accurate. But in neither the story she promoted nor the more complete story does anything like hope appear. The promoted story doesn't emphasize hope at all, but rather fatigue. She was too tired to get up, so she refused. Now, that fatigue may have been hope-tinged, but we can easily assert a range of other sentiments to explain her action in the promoted story. In the story, she promoted as true, but wasn't quite. We have the same challenge in the more accurate account. Similarly, if we were to look at the activities of either Fannie Lou Hamer or Ella Baker, two of the most important organizers during the civil rights movement or any other period, we don't find an emphasis on hope at all. There was a noted emphasis on group cooperation, group initiative, and group loyalty, but neither activist placed much stock in hope. While hope has undoubtedly functioned in a range of different instances then, it's not clear that it's either necessary or sufficient to generate action or to sustain action, either in cases of long odds or in cases with better odds. It's possible, however, that there are certain populations that require hope. Again, kids may be one such population, because kids are much more easily influenced than adults by positive and negative stimuli. Perhaps they'll even be more susceptible to the types of negative action associated with the lack of hope. Here, Cornell West's work on Black nihilism comes to mind. Even though West placed more weight on lovelessness than hopelessness, he argues that without hope, Black people are left without the foundation they need for progressive action. And while he locates this within Black populations in general, he argues that it's located more specifically in Black youth. But even here, with the kids, this case is weak. We know that children develop far more rapidly than adults do, and that their brains are far more malleable, which suggests they may indeed be far more open to suggestion. However, we also know that children are far more resilient than they're given credit for. In part because their brains are more plastic than those of their adult peers, they have a better ability to bounce back from a range of trauma than adults do. We can make somewhat similar claims for adult populations that are particularly downtrodden, people for whom life can be so difficult that it can be hard to get up in the morning. Indeed, I'd argue that this population may be a harder case to argue against than kids, because while kids are resilient, downtrodden adult populations are less so. In fact, they may need hope more than other populations. At the same time, though, there are even challenges with this population. Even the prisoners of war that refer to hope, that emphasize the work hope performed for them, noted that hope itself wasn't sufficient. Perhaps in moments hope functioned, but in general, it wasn't hope that drove them. Further, there's at least some evidence that hope performed the opposite work, that hope, instead of giving them the strength to persist, sapped that strength when it was clear that the thing hoped for wasn't coming in the way or the time promised. Hope then is no panacea. Even in the strongest cases, it isn't clear that hope functions in all cases that the way that proponents suggest it does, and that in some instances, it appears as if hope functions in a way that actually goes against the central claims. Yet claims about hope persist. What are we to make with them? I suggest that it might work to conceive of hope as a vital component of the virtue project that Bonnie Honig writes about. And in this particular moment, or perhaps better written, in the moment that ended on November 3rd, 2016, Hope worked to actively displace politics by generating a top-down consensus model that staved off criticism of elites, and that works, oddly enough, to dampen the potential for political change that one would think hope was necessary for. And while I'd argue that hope serves this function in general, I think that there's a range of ways that we see this in elite discourse and in the behavioral turn in Black politics. Because I'm interested in the conversation we have, I'm just going to stop there. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much. So I won't stand in the way of too much conversation, but as you can see, when we were putting together this panel, we wanted to kind of put these two pieces into conversation. And so, as you can see, I think we have a fruitful conversation here. So on the one end, we have this kind of idea that in both our profession and in our politics, we have a sense and a need maybe to bring joy into the conversation, and that, maybe we've shifted too much away from joy and focused too much on the deficit. And so how can we now bring joy back into the conversation is what I understand, Travis, to be getting us to think through. And on the other end, right, this idea that perhaps maybe we've moved too much towards maybe not joy, but hope as an affective term that then works to suppress politics, particularly in the Black community. And so I think that these two are interesting bookends. So just, as I was listening, I had a number of questions that came up for me, and I like to kind of pose them back. So putting these two into conversation, Travis, I'm just interested in, as you're hearing Dr. Spence talk about, what it means to think and reflect on hope and the way in which it may actually harm Black politics and suppress Black politics. Where does joy and hope fit together? Do you need hope in order to have joy? Are those two very different concepts? And so I'd like to hear some reflections on that. And then for Dr. Spence, I had a couple questions in terms of, so at times I wasn't necessarily fully tracking your argument in terms of the necessary and sufficient. So at some points, it felt like you were saying that joy is not necessary. And then at other points, maybe not sufficient. And so I'm just curious, can you parse that out a bit? Is it that it's not necessary, or is it just that it's not sufficient? And then, or I guess the other question is, is all hope equal? Are there different ways in which we can think about joy, hope? Are there some more helpful kind of hopes, that could be more politically activated and not suppressive, and or is all hope, the same? And so, just curious to maybe just start the conversation there. So we'll start off with Travis and his reflections, and then kick it back to Dr. Spence.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks again. Yeah, thanks, Melissa, for that interesting presentation. Definitely a lot to consider, and thanks, Justin, for the question around, this hope harm Black politics, and then the question, like, do you need hope to have joy? All these things do come to like definitional issues sometimes. Like, and one thing I was, I guess, trying to highlight earlier is just like this, how joy isn't, like saying that these issues, like real issues don't exist, or like it's not a call for like a kind of kumbaya-ness, or like, or or can be done with grief. But one of the examples that you have, or protests, is like when sometimes when you look into stuff around Black joy, you'll see the juxtaposition between like protest and then like celebration afterwards. Like, like I showed a picture earlier around like people, this Black Joy Parade, but like there's been several protests that, people are talking about the injustices, but at the same time, like also celebrating the life and, the brevity, like life is short. And also just recognizing the power in community, and also recognizing, how the Black community expresses itself at time, whether it's through song or through dance, or through other activities that bring people together. So yeah, I'll say that, I didn't focus a lot on defining it, but like the way I look at joy, it is something that can exist, almost like regardless of, whether something positive or negative is going on per se. It's kind of like a reminder to be able to, honestly, I guess, not hold back, or like, to be fully present, essentially. I think there's a lot of things that can, rob people from being present, and or being at their full capacity because of whatever restrictions they're feeling, being positive or negative. So, but definitely a lot to consider around like some of these tensions. Like, because there's a way you can focus on, you move in one direction and you can over focus on something, or you can have this, what some people will say, around, when people, they're kind of rough categories of like optimists and pessimists, and I see good comments in the chat. But I think overall, just what people are writing, like the importance of self-care, and all this work, like whether you're taking an approach of like thinking about hope or not, like just overall, I guess the work I'm doing is like really, once again, really connected to just like we're doing a lot of great work over many years, and it's been evident just like the wear that it has on people, like whether like whether your low income, or whether less mentioned, like whether you're president of the United States, like there's definitely a lot of things that can worry you as a Black person in this country, but joy kind of being a buffering thing, because it's like it's psychiatry, like people talk about kind of protective factors, essentially, that people that could be helpful for folks, especially when dealing with trauma, like racial trauma and stuff like that. And some of the things kind of, to me, connects somewhat to this idea of joy, and kind of like those different tips I had that people pursue. But yeah, up there.
Thank you for that.
Thank you for the question. So I'll take the last one. Is hope equal? Is all hope the same? And what I'll do is I'll go in a different direction, right? Because I'd say the answer is no. Not all hope is the same. You can distinguish, for example, between the hope in an individual from a hope in a cause, right? And there are other ways to think about how to cut that. And I think I can make an argument, or at least I can make an argument about how some of those values may be more important. Some of those ways hope functions are more important than others, and we can maybe think about ways politically to access or promote these forms versus other forms. But with that said, what I think is more fruitful for us to think about is not so much about different forms of hope, but if we're going to focus on affect, what are other forms of affect that may be more powerful? And then to the extent that we don't see these other forms of affect deployed, given their power, what does that say politically? So one way to think about it is just to think about I assume that the people on this call or people in the Zoom session cast a ballot against the former president, against Trump. Now, think about once you were in that, to the extent that affect drove you, I'm willing to bet it wasn't hope that drove you to the polls. In my case, I was pissed as fuck. I was angry. I was more angry than I think I can imagine myself as ever having been. I lost 15 or 16 people to COVID. I've said this on other calls. My family isn't here. Like there's all types of dynamics. It wasn't hope that drove me to participate in the protest against George Floyd. It wasn't hope that caused me to vote against Trump. I was fucking pissed. If we think about all those folk who engaged us and then all those folk who are on the street globally to protest George Floyd's death, was that hope at work? I'd argue that's not hope. That's another type of affect. And I'd argue that there's at least that affect, that sense of deep anger and frustration that generated more political activity than hope did. So given that, why don't we see anger actually drawn upon? I suggest that we don't see anger drawn upon because in a way it's anti-liberal and is definitely anti-Black liberal. So to that extent, the call for hope isn't just a matter of moving folks to action. It actually reproduces a certain type of Black politics that is not transformative, and that's not only not transformative, but that's actually regressive as opposed to progressive. So yes, there are different ways that hope works. There are different forms of hope that we can imagine deploying, but I'm interested in, to the extent that I'm interested in affect, I'm interested in why is it that we're not looking at those other dynamics. And it's interesting because when I was hearing Travis's talk, I really wanted him to talk theoretically about joy, because there are all these people, as Holt has mentioned. Every time I can give a shout out to Holt, I'm gonna do it. Every time. There's the work that Holt has mentioned, and there are a number of other folk who theorize joy. There are a number of folk who have talked about hope, but there are a range of folk who've talked about anger. Like Audre Lorde talked specifically about the role anger has played and should play. A number of folk write about anger. So what is it about this moment that past moment, where folks were not just saying that hope was something that we should be moving towards, but that the lack of hope is dangerous? right? That's what I didn't get to. There are all types of things. You know, as I was reading that paper, I knew that there was all types of slippage, all types of problems. One of the things that I didn't mention was that they actually, Melvin Rogers, the theorist at Brown, he actually argued that Coates' work was dangerous. That it was dangerous to articulate a world without hope. Now, that's not what Coates is doing, but he said it was actually dangerous. We now know after November 3rd, 2016, A, that Coates was more right than wrong, and B, there are a couple of things that are actually more dangerous for Black people than the lack of hope. I'll shut up there. Oh, I'm pissed.
All right, we have some questions in the chat. We have some, I imagine some other questions. We can play this a couple of ways. I also see that Kennedy Hill has joined us. I'm gonna assume that he's probably in Central Time. I think he's in Arkansas. So we unfortunately started at 10:15 Central and 11:15 Eastern. But we'll see if we can I'll work you in, but I don't want to truncate this conversation a bit. So I don't know. I mean, does anybody want to either weigh in on some of the conversation questions in the chat, or do we want to have someone from the audience ask a question?
So Hoda mentions block. So this is basically a paper of a long of a book project that's either going to be about hope or it's going to be about something I'm calling, for lack of a better term, Afro-realism. If somebody has a fucking better term for that, excuse me, just holler at me. And Ernest Bloch has written the book on hope. I think I have it in the back somewhere, along with works that examine the real psychology of hope. Like, what's the psychology behind it, right? And I think that, I think there's something to be said for hope. It does something, but I'm really more interested in the focus on it. And I think as Dr. Walker noted, that, yeah, I think it does generate a certain type of passivity. I mean, I live in Baltimore. I live right outside of Baltimore. I was here during the uprising. I was here for Occupy Baltimore. All the fundamental transformations we've seen in Baltimore, much less the world over, I can't connect hope to any of that stuff. You know, I just can't. So I think it tends to, in this moment, reproduce a deeply problematic form of politics that we just have to contest.
And I see that Dr. Walker also has a question about the Black hope versus white rage. Is that correct? Yeah, I don't know if you want to elaborate any.
Oh, well, thank you. Oh, wow. That is, wow. What I will say is that white rage is more powerful, and B, is more politically destructive. Is deeply politically destructive. So as I'm thinking about the potential of Black anger against Black rage against white rage, it's interesting because I think when I think about Black rage, I think about a force that's both productive in that it generates a certain type of action, but it's also productive politically in that it generates a certain type of positive political action, right? So I think it's, again, I think particularly after the election of Trump, and particularly given the pandemic, it would do us well to really think carefully about that, about how to tap in. If we're tapping into affect, how we basically tap into rage, right? I think there's a problem with tapping into affect more broadly because there's no affect that's sustainable. You know, sustained political action requires more than affect. But to the extent we are tapping into affect, again, I think there's more important to deal with rage. And actually, so another way to think about that Black hope versus white rage dynamic is that if white rage is the thing we're fighting, you know, if hope does anything, it's not going to contest white rage. If we're really what we're fighting, we're in a political battle. We're going to be in this battle, and it's literal. We are now in a cold civil war. We will be fighting this cold civil war for the rest of our lives. that fight is going to be against white rage. You don't defeat rage with hope. Not at the micro level. Some of you may have actually had fist fights. I've never seen somebody win a fist fight with hope, but not at the meso level where they're trying to make change in the city. Not at the macro level with trying to make change at the state level. That's not, no, you don't. If we're fighting white rage, you don't use hope at all.
So I'm curious, I mean, so this is not the first time that we've tapped into Black rage or being pissed off, you know, in terms of movements. And so when you look back and reflect, so even going back to the civil rights movement and that time period, you had these kind of different affects, you know, pitted against each other, sometimes literally actually being against each other, sometimes more sensationalized by white media. But I'm just curious about, you know, are there lessons to be learned from the past and how we tapped into it effectively, or right, in ways that it wasn't actually helpful, or you know, in the larger political discourse, not helpful, or, you know, so I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that.
The one thought I do have is that to the extent we're thinking about this issue, what we also have to think about is not just the affect, but we have to think about the institutions, the institutional work that we need, for two reasons. One is because, again, sustained action is not the function of affect. Affect, any affect you have, you know, there's a spike, right? And then it tails off. Or there's always a spike somewhere. So either at the beginning, like for example, I really get excited about a project at the beginning of it, and then it sucks at the end. Like at the end, I'm just dragging. Some people, you know, they build up to it, but it's not sustained affect. It's not sustained excitement. It just doesn't work like that. What you need are institutions, because institutions actually create the conditions for labor across time efficiently with far less energy than would be required if the institution didn't exist. So we've got institutions like the Black church loomed large, particularly after it was changed. So when Black folk changed Black churches during the civil rights movement, Black churches worked to actually sustain action. And then through that action, they actually, there are moments that they wielded hope and other forms of affect to move action forward. Along the same lines, as I'm thinking about it, we can also think about the role of popular culture and cultural performance. So I'm thinking more specifically about the work of the Negro spirituals, the songs that people would sing, you know, like "We Shall Not Be Moved," for example. Like that stuff ends up generating a certain type of affect. It creates a certain type of space for Black joy, even in the presence of Jim Crow, right? So that actually performs a certain type of work. So as I'm thinking about it, to the extent we see hope perform work, is when it's doing its best work, it's connected to institutions. It's not necessarily connected to individuals, right? Now the challenge as I'm talking about this is the thing I'm talking about, anger. Like as I'm thinking about it, I can't think of an institution that levies anger. There is no, you know, like we can connect the church and hope easily. There's not a single institution I can think of that Black people have that uses anger. You know, so there may be, so as I'm talking, one possible argument against the case I'm making is that hope is a form of affect that's easily connected to pre-existing institutions than any other form of affect that we might have, or the forms of affect that I would think we should think about.
So that's interesting. I mean, so one of the things I was thinking about as I was saying, whether real or not, I mean, is this idea of the Nation of Islam, for instance, being painted as something, you know, built on Black rage as opposed to hope. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I don't. As I was talking out loud, the Nation of Islam popped up. I think that that elites, that Nation of Islam elites, Louis Farrakhan stood out. The brother that passed away, he was ejected from the nation in the mid-90s. His line that's in Public Enemy. We've lost our religion, our culture, our God. Many of us, by the way we act, we even lost our mind. So that was a brother. He used to be in the nation and he was removed. I forgot his name. And he was actually removed because all he did was really talk. A lot of his rhetoric was hateful. And that's why the Nation of Islam itself removed him. So I can see their elites doing that, but I would be willing to bet, because their services are so private, that that's only a public performance, a thin slice of their broader activity. Certainly their framework, like the structure of their religion, is based on the idea that there is going to be a heaven created on earth. So that's not, even as it's probably going to be, even as that heaven on earth, I think would entail basically the destruction of whiteness in a certain way. But that's not, the heaven on earth is the thing they're still moving toward. So that's still kind of a hopeful type thing. Wow, I didn't think I'd end up arguing against myself by the end of the day. I had to think about that.
Yeah, any other thoughts or? So institutions are group affiliations institutions, or would you separate them? I'm thinking about I'm gonna get the name wrong, but the group of individuals who've been kind of showing up at rallies, and it's like
white or black?
Black, not like something like, not giving a fuck kind of group or whatever. I forget, but they're kind of the counter to the white raid, to the white vigilantes who show up at rallies, and they're the ones who are there with their guns as black people saying, we are not gonna be coward. Would that be a type of institution that might be an example of rage? I mean, maybe it's not politics per se, I don't know, but I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I don't. So when I think about institutions, I'm being a bit narrow in my conception. So that is on purpose, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't think about that as an institution. Like I can think about, like, there are, that doesn't work as an institution in the way that I mean it. That is a group that endures, but that's that's basically like a loosely organized group. I don't think of that as an institution like I think of like a church, an advocacy organization, a specific that has rules, a structure, the whole 9 yards. I think about that as a different type of thing. And in fact, thinking about anger may be mostly deployed, to the extent it's deployed consistently, in loosely structured organizations like that. So that's the perfect example. Like some folk who every now and then get together to either defend Black folk or just to kind of like beat people up randomly, whatever. I mean, that's something that's a different type of thing. Got a lot more work to do.
So we have about 5 more minutes left. I see Hoda ask like Black Lives Matter.
So Hoda, were you asking about? So Black Lives Matter. So with that, are you asking kind of? So I don't think about Black Lives Matter as in, Black Lives Matter is not a church, right? But at the same time, it's not just folk organized randomly, or even not organized randomly, but organized, but they come together and then disperse. I think of them as an in-between type of thing. So then the question is an in-between type. Wow. So I think anger can have a specific role in that in-between type of thing. I think that's it. Or that I think that's something that's worth exploring. And it might be that it works best within those in-between type of things. You know, as I'm thinking about it, it could be, so another way to think about anger as I'm talking about it out loud is as the impetus for the thing. So it's anger that leads to so we don't have Black Lives Matter without anger, right? So anger creates Black Lives Matter, right? So anger creates the thing that transforms. Hope doesn't create the thing that transforms.
It's hope needed to sustain it, though.
Yeah. Maybe it sustains it, but once it's there, but it's anger that generates the push, and it's arguably anger that generates a certain type of intensity. I can't think about, so joy and anger are like wonderful flip sides because joy can actually generate a certain type of spike. Hope isn't like that. I can't remember ever feeling like it's a beautiful day outside. So when I leave this thing, I'm gonna just go outside and bask in the beautiful day. And that's gonna give me joy. Hope doesn't work like that physiologically. It doesn't, and I don't think it works like that politically. Joy works in a certain way. Anger works in a certain way.
This has been really rich. I want to thank our panelists, and we're sorry that we had to miss Kennedy Hill's presentation, but we vowed to stay in touch and to continue to support each other's work there. I want to thank the audience for their great questions and their great dialogue in the chat, and so. I think we'll get kicked off in 2 minutes. So if there's any parting thoughts or words, I'll leave the floor to you all. All right. If not, enjoy your weekend and have a great rest of the conference. Take care.
Good to see everybody. Oh my God, this has been dope.
Take care, y'all.
Hoda. Yes.
Take care, everyone.
Love seeing Hoda. So love seeing Hoda. This is awesome. Turn your mute off so I can actually hear your voice. Hold on a second. Let me see if
You are okay.
Yeah.
Is this okay? Yeah.
Yeah, I hear you.
So you are very funny. You are very funny. But I do think you have a point about the Black Lives Matter movement being a different breed of institutions, that is capable of it took a lot of organizing to get it done. And if you read the women who's, their memoirs are so interesting because it took a lot of elbow grease from them to do what they did. And it just, and there's no question that the fuel of it, was anger, and just a fed upness with it. Like, we just can't take any more kind of thing, I can't breathe, is like, once you can't breathe, you can't live, right? Yes. So it is self-defense, really, it was a self-defense movement. So I think you have a wonderful paper in the making.
Yeah, and I got so pissed at the way. So first of all, the Melvin Rogers piece. So Melvin Rogers writes the piece against Ta-Nehisi Coates in Dissent, and then I end up writing a response to it. And we actually end up having an interesting conversation about it at APSA. But just to argue that it was, people went in on Coates like nobody's business, right? Like nobody's business. 30 seconds. And the whole thing was that he's not hopeful enough. And then next thing you know, we get Trump, right? Like next thing you know, we get Trump. Like how, I'd say more, but we're about to get kicked off. I'm so glad I saw you. Again, I'm so glad.
Travis, you were great. Lester, you were great. Travis, I loved your paper. I just loved the way you're looking at joy. So important, so important.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. We have to create space for this. You know, so I will say that. We have
I think this will help. I mean, I definitely learned a lot. Yeah, it's from your talk, Lester. Yeah, I mean, there are definitely a lot of things to consider. Yep, and yeah, glad to be in this space. So.
All right.
All right, y'all be cool.